Ready? Go!
How's it going? I hope you've been well. Today we're taking a look at the Vampiric Bloodline pre-constructed commander deck from the latest set, Innistrad Crimson Vow, and we'll be giving it the old $50 upgrade treatment. This Precon is a tribal deck that's all about vampires and has quite a few big ones that you can easily cheat out for free, and lets you really take advantage of the new blood token mechanic. It's a high value, high synergy deck that's great for both new and old players, and if you're looking to truly experience the flavor of the Crimson Vow set, this is the deck that you want to be bringing to your next vampire wedding. In the video description down below, you'll find timestamps for each section of the video, as well as a link to my upgraded deck list and a spreadsheet that neatly shows which cards have been kept, removed, and added. Starting off with the commander, the Vampiric Bloodline Precon gives us two options, Strafon Mor Progenitor and the partner pairing of Lauren the Diversion and Camber the Plunderer. While Lauren and Camber do care about sacrificing creatures and seeing creatures die, they don't really synergize with the other tools in the deck and would probably work better in a goad-themed deck. Strafon, on the other hand, is a legendary flying vampire that says, at the beginning of your end step, create a blood token for each player who lost life this turn. Now, this is a decent little effect, but here comes the good part. Whenever Strafon attacks, you may sacrifice 2 blood tokens. If you do, you may put a vampire card from your hand onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking. It gains indestructible until end of turn. So, with Strafon in our command zone, what is the rest of the deck trying to do? Well, to set the stage for which cards we'll be putting on the chopping block and cutting from the Precon, let's take a look at the main mechanics that Strafon and his band of vampires are working with. Blood tokens. These brand new tokens are innocent little artifacts that let you pay 1 and sacrifice the artifact to discard a card and draw a card. Now at its base level it's just a 1 mana discard 1 and draw 1, but even that's fine because this deck has some great discard targets that will give us bonus value and essentially let us draw cards for free. After we stack up a few of these blood tokens, we can then start cheating out huge vampires and draining our opponents every turn. Drain. Speaking of draining our opponents every turn, this vampire deck is hitting all the flavor points with a ton of cards that let us take our opponent's life and add it onto ours. The drain effects will also trigger other cards that care about our opponents losing life, letting us generate a ton of value while healing and pinging our enemies down. Madness and discard. Madness is an effect that lets us cast our spells from exile if we can find a way to discard them. And since we'll be generating tons of blood tokens throughout the game, we're not going to have any trouble finding ways to discard. The combination of Madness and Discard will let us cycle through our deck, draw a ton of cards, and get even more of our value generators into play. With cards like Falconwrath Gorger, Falconwrath Forebear, and Squee Goblin Nabob, we'll be enjoying all the benefits of Madness and Discard with none of the drawbacks. Reanimation. What's better than cheating out a bunch of vampires for free? Bringing them all back from the graveyard to do your bidding over and over again. This deck wants to attack and trade with its vampires and occasionally sacrifice them. So we have cards like Call to the Netherworld, Victimize, and Malakir Rebirth, among others, to make sure we don't lose our valuable vampires for good. Now you probably noticed that some of the cards I quickly mentioned are new additions to the deck, so let's go through the 99 in more detail and figure out how we can really power up this Precon on a $50 budget. For each card type, creatures, instants and sorceries, lands, etc., I'll go through which cards to keep, remove, and add. And then at the end we'll take a look at some stats like mana curve, card counts, and where you can find some room to add your own picks to the deck. The first creature that's a keeper in this deck is Falconwrath Gorger. It's a 1 mana 2/1 vampire that says each vampire creature card you own that isn't on the battlefield has Madness. The Madness cost is equal to its mana cost. And as I mentioned earlier, Madness basically means if you discard a card with Madness, you have a chance to pay a cost and cast that card instead of discarding it. Now, Falconwrath Gorger says the Madness cost is equal to its mana cost, so we're not getting a discount on the casting cost of our vampires, But what this allows us to do is use our effects on something like a blood token to put the card we're discarding onto the battlefield, and then just draw a card for 1 mana. Next is Blood Artist, a classic that's almost a decade old at this point. Now the deck does care about creatures dying and the drain effect, but it's not the main game plan of the deck. However, it's a decent 2-drop, it's a vampire, so it can stay. Blood Tithe Harvester is a 2-mana 3/2, so it's got decent 2-drop stats, it creates a blood token when it enters the battlefield, and it doubles up as a targeted removal spell. Unfortunately, you do have to wait a turn to use the removal since it's a tap ability, and you can only use it at sorcery speed, but just like our Blood Artist, the Blood Tithe Harvester is a decent 2-drop vampire, so it can stay. Here's another 2-drop vampire, but this one is Cordial, and it says whenever Cordial Vampire or another creature dies, put a +1/+1 counter on each vampire you control. Now this one is a little bit harder to drop on turn 2 since it costs 2 black, but later on in the game once you're ready to make some combat trades, or if you have ways to sacrifice creatures, you can combo with this card to pump up your vampires on board and help them push through damage to activate those combat abilities. Although this isn't your typical go-wide Edgar Markov style vampire deck, just getting this to trigger a couple of times on 1 or 2 of your vampires can turn them into must-answer threats, especially if they have combat triggers. Scion of Opulence is another vampire that cares about other vampires dying, but instead of getting +1/+1 counters, you get a treasure token. This is all fine and dandy, but we don't really care about ramping and treasure tokens in this deck. What we do care about is cheating out more vampires. So the bottom half of this card says, pay 1 red and sacrifice 2 artifacts. Exile the top card of your library. You may play that card this turn. Now you might be wondering, how are we going to consistently have not 1, but 2 artifacts to sacrifice? Well, our blood tokens, of course. If you can cast this card later on towards the mid game when you have mana and blood tokens to spare, this is a cheap and easy way to get more cards out of your deck and into play. Stromkirk Occultist is a 3-mana 3/2 trampling vampire that says, whenever Stromkirk Occultist deals combat damage to a player, exile the top card of your library. Until end of turn, you may play that card. So, similar to Scion of Opulence, except the price of the impulsive draw effect is combat damage. We're playing a deck that likes attacking, and we're often trying to push through damage, so having trample on this card really helps it do what it's meant to do. And then just to make this card even better, we can discard it with a blood token or one of our other abilities and then cast it at a 1-mana discount. Falconwrath Noble is a 4-mana 2/2 flying vampire that says, I'm an expensive blood artist. In all seriousness, there are a couple of these effects in the deck, and it's not one of the main things we're trying to do, but it does have tribal synergies, so we can get some extra value there, and it's also a flyer, so we can probably find some opportunities to get some combat damage through. Next is Blood Tracker, a 4-mana 2/2 flying vampire wizard that lets you put a +1/+1 counter on him at the cost of 1 black mana and 2 life. And it also says, when Blood Tracker leaves the battlefield, draw a card for each +1/+1 counter on it. This card is pretty medium, but the flying will help you push through and get your combat triggers off, and if it goes unattended for a few turns, it can become pretty chunky. The 2 life cost to buff this guy isn't a big deal since we have tons of ways to gain life in this deck, and once they finally remove Blood Tracker, we're probably going to be drawing a card or 2 at the very least. I've mentioned combat triggers a couple times so far, so here's a card that actually cares about combat, Sanctum Seeker. It costs 2 colorless and 2 black for a 3/4 vampire knight that says, whenever a vampire you control attacks, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. Again, another pretty medium temperature card, but the 3/4 stats make it a decent blocker, and by design you kind of just want to hold him back for defense and let him watch your other vampires attack. Now here's a spicy one that we'll be keeping in the deck, Anawan the Ruined Sage, a 5-mana 4/3 legendary vampire shaman that says, at the beginning of your upkeep, each player sacrifices a non-vampire creature. It's simple, straightforward, and pretty cutthroat. Every time the turn rotation passes back to you, everyone is going to have to sacrifice a non-vampire creature, so essentially, this card is something you want to destroy or counter on sight. Or it turns into a 3-for-1 removal spell. Now it does say each player and not each opponent, so that means we'll have to sacrifice one of our own non-vampire creatures, but if we can cast this at a time when we only have vampires on board, and to be fair that's going to be 99% of the time, then we're not going to be sacrificing anything. Bloodline Necromancer is a 5-mana 3/2, so very expensive for the stats, but it's a vampire wizard that says, when Bloodline Necromancer enters the battlefield, you may return target vampire or wizard creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. So this card is basically a reanimation spell with a 3/2 body. It doesn't have flying, but it does have lifelink, so we can gain some health back in a pinch if need be, or we can just hold it back as a blocker. With all that being said, the main reason we're keeping this card is just to reanimate something, so everything else is pretty much just flavor text. Champion of Dusk is 3 colorless and 2 black for a 4/4 vampire knight that says, when Champion of Dusk enters the battlefield, you draw X cards and you lose X life, where X is the number of vampires you control. So at a base level, this card is a 5-mana 4/4 that draws you 1 because the card itself is a vampire, but ideally you want to be playing this when you have a minimum of 2 other vampires on the board. Most players value a card draw at 2 mana, so if you're playing Champion of Dusk at 5 mana, you want to make sure you're drawing at least 3 cards. Malakir Bloodwitch is another card that cares about the number of vampires you control, and it says, when Malakir Bloodwitch enters the battlefield, each opponent loses life equal to the number of vampires you control, and you gain life equal to the life lost this way. So it's a simple drain effect attached to a 5-mana 4/4 vampire. It's not really a card I'm excited to pay the 5 mana for, but we could cheat this out with Strafon, our commander, and at that point, it's a respectable 0 mana 4/4 flyer with an ETB life drain. Another expensive vampire we're keeping in the deck is Crossway Troublemakers. It's a 6 mana 5/5 that says attacking vampires you control have Death Touch and Lifelink. Whenever a vampire you control dies, you may pay 2 life. If you do, draw a card. So Crossway Troublemakers is going to make all of our vampires really hard to block with Death Touch, and if someone does decide to block or kill your vampires, you can pay 2 life and draw a card for each one. Now you'll notice a few cards in this deck say pay life and draw a card, but with so many ways to gain life in this deck, all of those cards pretty much just say draw a card for free. Crossway Troublemakers is also going to give our attacking vampires lifelink as well, so you don't even have to worry about gaining life from other sources to pay for your card draw. At 6 mana, this card does seem pretty expensive, but I'd say it pays for itself in value quite quickly after it hits the battlefield. And of course, we have ways to cheat this card out for free. Markov Enforcer is our targeted removal spell on a stick. It's a 6 mana 6/6 vampire soldier that says whenever Markov Enforcer or another vampire enters the battlefield under your control, Markov Enforcer fights up to 1 target creature an opponent controls. So not only is Markov Enforcer going to fight another creature when it enters the battlefield, whenever we play another vampire, Markov Enforcer is then going to fight another target of our choice. Then the bottom part of the card is basically whenever Markov Enforcer kills something, you create a blood token. What I find a bit silly about this card is that it doesn't say Markov Enforcer may fight up to 1 target creature an opponent controls. This is a must-happen effect. So if the only available target is something with Death Touch or, something that's big enough to kill Markov Enforcer, playing another vampire is basically a death sentence for this card. Now you can obviously just avoid those scenarios by not playing another vampire, but I just thought it was kind of funny that if you're not paying attention, you could potentially just send your own 6 mana 6/6 to the graveyard and get nothing out of it. Getting close to the end of the creatures that we'll be keeping in our Vampiric Bloodline Precon deck, we've got some more high mana value cards, starting with Patron of the Vein. A 6 mana vampire, but it's also a 4/4 flyer that doubles as a removal spell. For 4 colorless and 2 black, when Patron of the Vein enters the battlefield, destroy target creature an opponent controls. Whenever a creature an opponent control dies, exile it and put a +1/+1 counter on each vampire you control. So in a pinch, it's a 6 mana destroy target creature, which isn't great by any means, but if we can get this out for free, then it's a 0 mana 4/4 flyer that destroys target creature, and that's a whole lot better. By that time in the game, we're likely to have a board state of 2 or 3 vampires, including our commander, so if the removal portion of this card resolves, we'll also be looking at a nice little buff to our vampires already in play. Now the last few 6-drops were pretty underwhelming, but thankfully this precon also comes with Timothar, Baron of Bats, a 6 mana 4/4 legendary vampire that says, whenever another non-token vampire you control dies, you may pay 1 and exile it. If you do, create a 1/1 black bat creature token with flying. It gains, when this creature deals combat damage to a player, sacrifice it and return the exiled card to the battlefield tapped. So basically what Timothy here does is protect your creatures by being able to reanimate them, and he's also able to protect himself with his own ward effect. Now Timmy is a bit expensive for just 4/4 in stats, but if we can cheat him out with Strafon, then we're on the way to Value Town. Another spicy card we're keeping is Butcher of Malakir, a 7 mana 5/4 with flying that reads, whenever Butcher of Malakir or another creature you control dies, each opponent sacrifices a creature. Now we're not heavy into the aristocrats sacrifice their own creatures type of theme in this deck, but we do want to attack during our combat phases, so Butcher of Malakir is going to force our opponents to make some hard choices once creatures start trading or getting removed. It's also a vampire, so it gains the benefits of other synergies in our deck, and it's a flyer, so if it goes unanswered, that's 5 damage in the air that our opponents have to deal with. And last but definitely not least, the final creature card that comes in the precon that we'll be letting stay in the deck is Shadowgrange Archfiend. This card is a huge 7 mana 8/4 demon that makes each opponent sacrifice their biggest creature when it enters the battlefield. Then, as an extra bonus, a little cherry on top if you will, we gain life equal to the greatest power among the creatures sacrificed. Now because this card is a demon, we can't exactly cheat it into play using our commander. However, if we can discard it using our blood tokens for example, we can pay the madness cost of 2 colorless, 1 black, and 8 life to cheat this massive demon into play. The biggest price to pay here is the 8 life, but as I've mentioned multiple times so far, our life total isn't a big concern to us since there are tons of ways for us to gain life throughout the game. The first 2 creatures we'll be removing from the Vampiric Bloodline precon are the partner commanders Lauren and Camber. Like I mentioned at the beginning, these 2 don't really fit with what the rest of the deck is trying to do, so we're not even going to put them in the 99. Next is a 1 mana 1/1 vampire, Indulgent Aristocrat. It's a lifelinker with a bit of aristocrat sacrifice stuff going on, as well as a go wide +1/+1 counter effect. And although we do have some of this stuff in the deck, it's not a main focus, and it's not really going to help our game plan. Stromkirk Condemned is another vampire that cares about the +1/+1 counters, but he can only do it once per turn, and we have to discard to pay for the effect. This card also has a casting cost of 2 black, which is pretty steep for a 2/2 vampire with little to no synergy. Anya's Ravager is a 3 mana 3/3 vampire that is really more of a dumb ogre because it must attack each combat if able, and then when it attacks, you have to discard your entire hand and draw 3. Now for sure this card has a place in a deck somewhere that's trying to pull off some crazy wheel shenanigans, but Vampiric Bloodline is not that deck. Yes, we want to discard and draw cards, but Anya's Ravager is doing way too much and way too fast. Next up we have Dark Imposter, a 3 mana 2/2 vampire assassin that's basically just an expensive patchwork crawler that can exile enemy creatures. After casting this for 3 mana, you can then pay another 4 colorless and 2 black for a single target removal, and all in all it's just way too slow and has no synergy with anything else the deck is trying to do. Rakesh Air is a simple 3 mana 2/2 vampire that says, whenever a vampire you control deals combat damage to a player, put a +1/+1 counter on it. It's fine, it's not a terrible card, but it fits more in a go-wide Edgar Markov style deck. Similarly, we have Stromkirk Captain. He's got first strike and gives your other vampires +1/+1 in first strike. And we do care about attacking in this deck, but again, it's better suited for a different style of vampire deck. Another very straightforward card here with Vampire Nighthawk, a 3-mana 2/3 Vampire Shaman with Flying, Death Touch, and Lifelink. Keywords are cool and all, but this card doesn't really have anything else going for it, and it doesn't synergize with the bigger themes of our deck. The next creature getting the cut is Midnight Arsonist, a 4-mana 3/2 vampire that destroys up to X target artifacts without mana abilities, where X is the number of vampires you control. Now, I've got two big complaints with this card. The first is that it only destroys artifacts without mana abilities. Most of the artifacts being played in Commander are mana rocks, so this is just a huge miss. The other issue I have is that if you control 3 vampires, you get to destroy 3 target artifacts total. It's not X per player, it's X total. So not only are mana artifacts off limits, it's closer to single target removal than it is a board wipe, so this card has gotta go. Crimson Honor Guard is a 5-mana 4/5 vampire knight with trample, and it says at the beginning of each player's end step, Crimson Honor Guard deals 4 damage to that player unless they control a commander. This card is just an understated 5-drop. By the time you get this down, your opponents will have their commanders out or enough mana to bring their commander out if they want to avoid the 4 damage. And the damage happens at the end of each player's end step, so on their turn, they're always going to have the opportunity to get their commander out if it isn't out already. So this card is just an easy cut. Bloodsworn Steward is another card that cares about commanders being in play. It's a 4-mana 4/4 flying vampire knight that says commander creatures you control get +2/+2 and have haste. Now don't get me wrong, +2/+2 and haste is a really strong buff, but it only hits your commander and you're letting your opponents know it's coming before it happens. If you want to take advantage of the haste, you'd be casting Bloodsworn Steward first and then your commander, which will likely take 2 turns to pull off, so it's just way too slow and obvious. However, it does say commander creatures, as in plural, so maybe this would fit better in a partner commander deck. Getting close to the end of the creature section now, we have Bloodlord of Vazgoth, a 5-mana 3/3 vampire with Bloodthirst 3, which is, if an opponent was dealt damage this turn, this creature enters the battlefield with 3 +1/+1 counters. Whenever you cast a vampire creature spell, it gains Bloodthirst 3. So this card is similar to Bloodsworn Steward in the sense that it gives a pretty significant buff to your creatures, but it's also a really slow effect that everyone can see coming. This is the type of card that you want to resolve and protect for a turn rotation, and then once it gets back to you, the idea is to push combat damage through and then cast a bunch of vampire creature spells to give them all +3/+3. It's just so many extra steps, it's so slow, and for 5 mana, it's too expensive to not be helping out with the main themes of the deck. Another pricey vampire we're going to be cutting is Necropolis Regent, a 6-mana 6/5 with flying. Whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, put that many +1/+1 counters on it. Again, this is a card that's more appropriate in one of those go-wide Edgar Markov style decks. You basically want to establish a decent sized board, slam this down, and then pump up all of your creatures that are able to get combat damage through. It's a finisher card that requires you to establish this critical mass style of board, and this Vampiric Bloodline deck cares more for long-term value. Now this is a card that just confuses me. Vampiric Dragon. I've probably read it about 1,000 times and I still can't figure out how it would be worth playing. It's an 8-mana 5/5 vampire dragon with flying, and it gets a +1/+1 counter whenever it kills something. You can also pay 2 mana to ping a creature for 1 damage. Even if you were to cheat this out for free, it's pretty much just a 5/5 flyer that doesn't do anything else. It doesn't even get flavor text because these useless abilities take up all the space. Definitely cutting this card. And lastly on the list of creatures that are getting the cut, Nirkana Revenant. A 6-mana 4/4 that says whenever you tap a swamp for mana, add an additional black mana. You can also pay 1 black mana to give it +1/+1 until end of turn. So essentially it's a mana doubler attached to a 4/4 body, and we have to pay 6 mana just to get it into play. So best case scenario is we cheat this out with our commander on turn 4 or 5 after attacking. Our commander Strafon costs 4 mana. So at its best, this is a 4-cost mana doubler that comes down on turn 4 or 5, and then it has to survive a full turn rotation. Now as you end your turn, on your board you have your commander Straphon and a mana doubler that could potentially turn itself into an 8/8 or a 10/10. There is an extremely low chance that your opponents are going to ignore your board state with Nirkana Revenant and your commander down. So I've just accepted that I'm never going to be able to use this card, and that's why it's getting the cut. The last stop in the creature category is additions. If you've made it this far into the video, I just want to say thanks for watching. The creature section of the video is the biggest by a long shot, and we're almost done. Keep in mind, with all of our additions to the deck across all the different card types, we're trying to stay under a $50 budget. So, which creatures will we be adding to the Vampiric Bloodline Precon? First, we have Reckless Fireweaver, a 2-mana 1/3 that says whenever an artifact enters the battlefield under your control, Reckless Fireweaver deals 1 damage to each opponent. Despite the lack of vampire, life gain, or discard synergy, Reckless Fireweaver is going to be pinging all of our opponents every single time we generate a blood token. This is a great card to get down in the first couple of turns, and then the 3 toughness will help it survive a lot of low-cost removal options. Later on in the game, you can combo Reckless Fireweaver with your blood token generators for a quick burst of face damage. Next up is Vampire Socialite, a 2-mana 2/2 Vampire Noble with Menace. It's got a lot of text on it about putting +1/+1 counters on all of your other vampires if an opponent lost life, but to be completely honest, I just like that it's a bear with Menace. 2-mana 2/2s are decent, it's got Vampire Tribal synergy, and the Menace is going to help us get our combat damage through, especially during the early turns. Another 2-mana 2/2 vampire is Vermin Gorger, and it has a tap ability, sacrifice another creature, each opponent loses 2 life, and you gain 2 life. Now I've mentioned multiple times that we don't really care about the whole aristocrats thing and sacrificing our own creatures, but if you read Vermin Gorger closely, you'll notice that it doesn't say anything about non-token creatures or once per turn. If we're ever in a tight spot and we need the life gain, we can sacrifice a few of our pawns for a mass life drain effect. Just 1 sacrifice would gain us 6 life if all 3 opponents are still in the game, so this ability scales extremely well in a multiplayer format like Commander. Later on in the game, if we happen to draw Vermin Gorger and we have Butcher of Malakir available, we can not only drain our opponents, but also force them to sacrifice their own creatures at the same time. All in all, Vermin Gorger has a decent amount of utility for a 2-drop. Voldaren Bloodcaster is another 2-mana vampire that we'll be adding to the deck. It's a 2/1 flyer that says whenever Voldaren Bloodcaster or another non-token creature you control dies, create a blood token. And then if we have 5 or more blood tokens, Voldaren Bloodcaster transforms into Bloodbat Summoner, a 3/3 flyer that says at the beginning of combat on your turn, up to 1 target blood token you control becomes a 2/2 black bat with flying and haste. Now, if we can flip Voldaren Bloodcaster and then continue to make blood tokens with another creature, then the hasty bat payoff is a massive bonus. But realistically, we'll just be using this card on its front side as a 2-mana blood token generator. In the 3-mana slot, we have Falconwrath Forebear, a 3/1 vampire with flying. Now it does say that Falconwrath Forebear can't block, but that's fine because it has 1 toughness and flying. Its main purpose is to attack in the air every single combat, and if the damage goes through, we generate a blood token. Once Falconwrath Forebear meets its demise, we can pay 1 black mana and 2 blood tokens to bring it right back. Next is Florian Voldaren Scion, a 3-mana 3/3 legendary vampire with First Strike. At the beginning of your post-combat main phase, look at the top X cards of your library, where X is the total amount of life your opponents lost this turn. Exile one of those cards and put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. You may play the exiled card this turn. Now Florian does come with First Strike in order to make it easier to get that combat damage through. However, the amount of cards you get to look at is based on the amount of life your opponents lost this turn. It doesn't specifically say lost through combat. So there's a number of cards in the deck that let us ping and drain our opponents, so if we do that with Florian in play, we'll be able to cycle through our deck and see a ton of cards. Another 3-drop we'll be adding to the deck is Squee Goblin Nabob. Squee is a classic discard outlet because he reads, at the beginning of your upkeep, you may return Squee from your graveyard to your hand. So anything that causes us to discard and draw, like all the blood tokens that we'll be generating, turns into an effect that says, draw a card. At 50 cents, Squee is definitely a must-have for this deck. Next up is Anger. What's a deck that cares about discard if it doesn't have Anger and Squee? Anger is a 4-mana 2/2 with haste, and we do not care if there's a 10/10 blocker in the way because Anger says, as long as Anger is in your graveyard and you control a mountain, creatures you control have haste. It's not going to be difficult whatsoever to get Anger into our graveyard. I mean, we don't even need to cast the card, we can just discard it with a blood token and then all of our creatures will have haste. Definitely a must-have. Now this card is more on the medium side when it comes to spice level, but it's Vampire Spawn, a 3-mana 2/3 vampire that drains everyone for 2 when it enters the battlefield. It's got tribal synergy, it scales with multiplayer formats like Commander, and it's a decent little blocker. Turning up the heat a little, we have Yahenni Undying Partisan, a 3-mana 2/2 legendary vampire with haste. Whenever a creature an opponent controlled dies, put a +1/+1 counter on Yahenni. And if we sacrifice a creature, Yahenni gains indestructible until end of turn. Now despite having haste, I feel like Yahenni works better as a blocker thanks to being able to gain the indestructible. You also don't have to be the one that kills your opponent's creatures. As long as they die in any way or form, Yahenni's gonna get that +1/+1 counter. Being able to just get bigger over time as the game naturally plays out, combined with the fact that he can become indestructible, means that Yahenni is one of those must remove immediately before this gets out of hand type of cards. It doesn't have much synergy with the rest of the deck, but for only 2 colorless and 1 black mana, this is a really strong card. Another legendary vampire we'll be adding to the deck is Anya, Maid of Dishonor, a 4-mana 4/5 that creates a blood token the first time you cast a vampire creature spell each turn. Then for 2 mana, you can sacrifice another creature or blood token to drain everybody for 2. So with 3 opponents, we'll be getting 6 life back, and we can pretty much do this every single turn because we'll be casting vampire creature spells and then generating 1 blood token off of Anya, in addition to whatever blood tokens our other cards are generating. She's also just a 4/5 body for 4 mana, only 1 black pip and 1 red pip, and she's less than $2. So all in all, a great card to add to the deck. Next up is Archfiend of Ifnir, a 5-mana 5/4 demon with flying. It doesn't have any vampire or blood token synergy, but this thing is basically a board wipe on a big stick. Whenever you cycle or discard another card, put a -1/-1 counter on each creature your opponents control. And if you don't want the 5/4 flyer or you don't need the board clear, you can also just pay 2 to discard Archfiend of Ifnir and draw a card. My favorite thing about this card is that you can technically use it as a reoccurring board wipe until someone finally deals with it. With all the blood tokens and other discard activators in the deck, I think you can realistically set up a board wipe turn with this card and then rebuild your stash of blood tokens to do it again if need be. Another fan of reoccurring effects is Deathless Ancient, a 6-mana 4/4 with flying that says tap 3 untapped vampires you control, return Deathless Ancient from your graveyard to your hand. So in a perfect world, you wouldn't be paying 6 mana for this 4/4 flyer. Instead, you would be cheating it out with your commander, but even if you do pay the 6 mana for it, you don't really care if it gets countered or spot removed because you can just tap 3 of your vampires and bring it back to your hand. Now, if you're gonna tap out your attackers and blockers for a turn in order to bring this guy back to your hand, you definitely don't want to be paying the 6 mana for it. But for less than 50 cents in real world mana, I think our deck has room for this 4/4 flying vampire. And finally, the last creature card we'll be adding to the deck is Olivia's Attendants, a 6-mana 6/6 with menace that says, whenever Olivia's Attendants deals damage, create that many blood tokens. Now that is an absolutely bonkers effect. This card is really tough to block thanks to the menace and 6 power, so if you get the damage through 1 time with this card, you'll be generating 6 blood tokens immediately. And now that we're at the end of the creature section, I'm sure you have an idea of what we're using all those precious blood tokens for. At the bottom, this card also has some flavor text for 3 mana, but in all seriousness, we're running a few cards that care about our opponents taking damage, so it is possible you might get some value there. And I guess if you ever have like 6 to 12 mana just laying around, maybe you can ping down an entire creature. Next up, we'll be going through the instants and sorceries, enchantments, and mana base. And just like the creatures, we'll talk about the keepers, the cuts, and the additions respectively. Starting off with the keepers, we have Vandal Blast, an innocent little 1-mana sorcery that says destroy target artifact you don't control. Or you could make it a little less innocent and pay its overload cost of 5 mana and destroy each artifact you don't control. An artifact board wipe is definitely a keeper. Feed the Swarm is a 2-mana sorcery that says destroy target creature or enchantment an opponent controls. You lose life equal to that permanent's mana value. With tons of ways to gain life in this deck, we really don't care about the life cost. And I know it doesn't allow you to target planeswalkers, but I mean, we have tons of flying vampires in this deck. The planeswalker is already dead. Night's Whisper is another 2-mana sorcery, and this one says draw 2 cards. Again, we don't care about the life cost, so a 2-mana draw 2 can definitely stay in the deck. Ancient Craving is a 4-mana draw 3. You lose 3 life is just flavor text, don't worry about that part. Damnable Pact is a little bit more serious. It costs 2 black mana and X, where X is the amount of life you're willing to pay. But X is also the amount of cards you get to draw. So choose wisely. Up next is Rakdos Charm, a 2-mana instant spell that lets you choose one. You can exile everything out of someone's graveyard, or you can destroy an artifact, or you can make each creature ping its controller for 1. Most of the time you'll be using this to destroy an artifact at instant speed, but it's always nice to have a couple other options. We'll also be keeping Olivia's Wrath in the deck, which is a 5-mana sorcery that says each non-vampire creature gets -X until end of turn, where X is the number of vampires you control. So it's a one-sided board wipe if you're the only one playing vampires, and giving creatures negative stat counters is a great way to get around indestructible effects. And the last sorcery we'll be keeping is Blasphemous Act. It's an absolute unit at 9 mana, but it says this spell costs 1 less to cast for each creature on the battlefield. Blasphemous Act deals 13 damage to each creature. So maybe you run into a situation where you've got 4 or 5 vampires on the board, and Olivia's Wrath won't be enough to completely clear out the big creatures with 6 or more toughness. Well, in a situation like that, Blasphemous Act is actually going to cost less than Olivia's Wrath because it counts the opponent's creatures as well, and it's going to completely clear the board. It's a bit of a commitment at sorcery speed, but if you time this right and there's no mana up for a counterspell, Blasphemous Act is a full creature reset, and our deck has multiple ways to bring our vampires back from the grave. Now let's talk about the instants and sorceries that we'll be removing from the Vampiric Bloodline Precon, starting with Mob Rule. This is a 6-mana sorcery that lets us take control of all creatures with power 4 or greater, or we can take control of all creatures with power 3 or less. It's a pretty cool modular threaten effect, but this deck doesn't really care about attacking with our opponent's creatures. We've got tons of synergistic vampires in our deck, and we'd much rather attack with those. Sinister Waltz is another expensive sorcery that we'll be removing. It's a 5-mana, choose 3 target creature cards in your graveyard, return 2 of them at random to the battlefield, and put the other one on the bottom of your library. While the reanimation effect is tempting, at 5 mana this is just too costly to potentially low roll with that random effect. On average, this card is a 5-mana, return 1 card you want to the battlefield, and put the other card that you want on the bottom of your deck, never to be seen again. It's just not worth it in my opinion. Next up, we'll be removing Imposing Grandeur, another expensive sorcery that reads each player may discard their hand and draw cards equal to the greatest mana value of a commander they own on the battlefield or in the command zone. So this is an expensive wheel effect that our opponents can also benefit from. And we have so many cards in our deck that help us draw that we really don't have any reason to be playing Imposing Grandeur. Avacyn's Judgment is a 2-mana sorcery that deals 2 damage divided as you choose among any number of targets. So at its base level you get 2 little pings, but if you discard it you can pay the madness cost, which is X and 1 red mana, and instead of 2 damage, it can deal whatever amount of damage you paid for X. It's a really interesting card and I love the artwork, but it's just too many steps for too little damage, and at sorcery speed it's just not strong enough. Best case scenario is you discard it with a blood token and make X equal to 5 or 6, and then you can probably kill off 2 small creatures or 1 big creature, but we have much more efficient ways to remove threats and clear the board, so Avacyn's Judgment gets the cut. Speaking of inefficient removal, we'll also be cutting Urge to Feed, an instant for 2 black that says target creature gets -3/-3 until end of turn. You may tap any number of untapped vampire creatures you control, and if you do, put a +1/+1 counter on each of those vampires. Again, we have better options for single target removal, and we don't really care about the +1/+1 counters, especially if we need to tap our creatures to get them. Predator's Hour is a 2-mana sorcery that just doesn't really fit in the deck at all. It says until end of turn, creatures you control gain menace, and whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, exile the top card of that player's library face down. You may look at the card and play it for as long as it remains exiled, and you may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast that spell. So similar to Mob Rule, with this deck we don't really care about playing our opponent's cards or taking control of their creatures. We're going to get more advantage if we just stick to our own vampire game plan. And that's it for instants and sorceries that we're going to be taking out of the deck. Now let's take a look at the ones that we'll be adding. First up is Call to the Netherworld, a 1-mana sorcery that lets us return a target black creature from the graveyard to our hand. And if we're super desperate, we can discard this card with a blood token and cast it for free using Madness. Malakir Rebirth is another 1-mana reanimator, but this one is an instant and is better used as a combat trick. It says, choose target creature, you lose 2 life, until end of turn, that creature gains. When this creature dies, return it to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control. Once you get past turn 2 or 3, it's going to be pretty easy to cast something and still leave 1 mana up for Malakir Rebirth. So when you're trying to push through that combat damage and one of your opponents chooses to block, you can often trade for free and get your creature back. Worst case scenario, if you're getting mana screwed, Malakir Rebirth is also an MDFC with a tap land on the other side. Arterial Flow is another card that'll let us drain for 6 since Commander is often played with 3 opponents. But it's a 3-mana sorcery that also makes each opponent discard 2 cards. At 2 black mana and 1 colorless, it can be a little tricky to cast, but when you do, it's a cheeky little piece of card and life advantage. Pact of the Serpent is very similar to the other card draw pieces in the deck. It's a 3-mana sorcery that says, choose a creature type. Target player draws X cards and loses X life, where X is the number of creatures they control of the chosen type. So obviously you're going to be declaring vampires and then choosing yourself 99% of the time and then drawing a few cards, but it can also be used as burst damage against somebody else. Say for example, somebody has a turn where they create a bunch of dinosaur cat tokens or scoot swarms or anything like that. If their life total is low enough and their creature total is high enough, you could just straight up knock somebody out with a 3-mana sorcery. And if you ever get into that 0.0001% chance where someone could possibly lose by decking out, you could also use this card to mill them. So Pact of the Serpent is an interesting little card that can be used in a number of ways to have a big impact. Pointed Discussion is another draw spell we'll be adding. It's a 3-mana draw 2, lose 2 life, and create a blood token. So it's pretty fair in terms of mana cost to card draw, and you also get that bonus blood token on the side. So it's a nice little inclusion for less than 50 cents. Another card under 50 cents we'll be adding is Victimize. It's a 3-mana sorcery that says, choose 2 target creature cards in your graveyard. Sacrifice a creature. If you do, return the chosen cards to the battlefield tapped. So it's kind of similar to that Sinister Waltz card, which we'll be removing from the deck, but Victimize actually guarantees that we're going to reanimate the exact 2 creatures we want as long as the spell resolves. Sacrificing a creature is a small price to pay in this deck for a reanimate 2. Hagra Mauling is another MDFC that we'll be adding. It's a 2 colorless and 2 black to destroy target creature. It also has some flavor text that says it costs 1 colorless mana less if an opponent has no basic lands, so pretty much it's just a 4 mana destroy target creature. And of course, if you're in a pinch, you can always play it as a tap land, Hagra Broodpit. Another 4 mana destroy target creature we'll be adding is Terminal Agony, except with this card we can actually get the mana discount reliably. When we discard Terminal Agony, we get to pay the madness cost of 1 black and 1 red, so it's basically 50% off. What a deal! And the last sorcery we'll be adding to the deck is Edgar's Awakening. For 3 colorless and 2 black, you can return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. When you discard Edgar's Awakening, you may pay 1 black. When you do, return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. So in your average deck, this is a very expensive reanimate 1, but in our Vampiric Bloodline deck, we can easily discard this and cast it for 1 black. Another card under 50 cents, this one is a must-have. And just a reminder, I have a spreadsheet link in the video description below that has a list of all the cards to add and how much they all cost. But now let's talk about artifacts and which ones we'll be keeping in the deck. 5 out of the 6 artifacts we'll be keeping don't really need any sort of introduction. We have Soul Ring, Arcane Signet, Rakdos Signet, Swiftfoot Boots, and Commander Sphere. Your classic mana rocks and the boots with the fur. The last artifact we'll be keeping is Glasscast Heart. This is a 3 mana artifact that cares about vampires and blood tokens. Whenever our vampires attack, we get to create 1 blood token, and we can also pay 1 black and tap Glasscast Heart to create a 1/1 vampire token with lifelink. And the bottom part is a bit of a meme, but if we have 13 blood tokens, we can pay 2 black and sacrifice this artifact along with our 13 blood tokens to drain everybody for 13. So realistically, you're just going to be pumping out blood tokens and 1/1 vampires with this thing, but it's also got a funny little achievement unlock side to it. Moving on to the artifacts that we'll be removing, we've got Fire Diamond and Charcoal Diamond. 2 mana artifacts that come in tapped, and we really want our mana rocks to enter the battlefield untapped and ready to go. The last artifact we'll be cutting from the deck is Unstable Obelisk. It's a mana rock for 3 mana, which is just too expensive. And it has some extra flavor text on it that we don't care about. And finally, which artifacts are we adding to the Vampiric Bloodline Precon? Well, how about a 2 mana rock that doesn't come into play tapped, like Fractured Power Stone and Talisman of Indulgence. We'll also be adding Mind Stone for another untapped mana rock, but in a pinch, we can also sacrifice it to draw a card. And then finally, almost regrettably, we'll be adding Cryptolith Fragment. It's a 3-cost mana rock that comes into play tapped. I know. But the main purpose of this rock is to ping everybody for 1 every single time we use it. It can also transform, which realistically probably will never happen, but just to be thorough, if everyone, including ourselves, has 10 or less life, it transforms into Aurora of Emrakul, which is a 1/4 flying death touch that does 3 damage to everyone every time it attacks. I'm pretty sure everybody at your table is going to get annoyed with Cryptolith Fragment after 2 or 3 pings, so don't expect it to ever flip over. When it comes to enchantments, we won't actually be keeping any that come in the Precon, so let's talk about why we're removing the ones that we are, and what we're going to replace them with. First up is Molten Echoes, a 4 mana enchantment that creates token copies of the creatures we cast, and gives the token copies haste, but it then exiles them at the end of the turn. This is just too expensive for an effect that we have no plans to make any use out of. Underworld Connections is a 3 mana enchant land. Enchant land has tap, pay 1 life, draw a card. If you're confused by this card, don't worry, you're not the only one. It's basically just a turn 1 of your lands into a worse Phyrexian arena, and yeah, we don't want that in our deck. Arterial Alchemy. Now this one is actually really cool. It's a 3 mana enchantment that creates blood tokens and then lets us turn those blood tokens into equipment that give +2 power. While our plan is to make a ton of blood tokens, this isn't really an equipment-based deck. So it's a super cool card, I love the artwork, I love the idea, but it's just probably better suited in a red-white deck that actually cares about equipment. And lastly, we're going to remove Stensia Masquerade, a 3-mana enchantment that gives our creatures first strike when they attack. If they deal combat damage to a player, they get a +1/+1 counter. It also has a madness cost that doesn't really matter, and this deck just isn't all that concerned with the whole +1/+1 counter thing. So we're going to remove 4 enchantments from the deck and add 2, starting with Faith of the Devoted. This card says whenever you cycle or discard a card, you may pay 1. If you do, each opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. So it's another one of those cards that can drain for a total of 6, but it happens every single time we discard a card. And with our blood tokens and our other discard activators, we could drain for 6 multiple times in one turn. If this enchantment goes unchecked, these pings are really going to add up. And lastly, we'll be adding Breath of Fury. This is an awesome 4-cost enchantment aura that gives us an extra combat step at the cost of sacrificing a creature. And if we're attacking with our commander, Strafon, we can cheat a vampire onto the battlefield with each combat. Not to mention all of the other cards in the deck that care about combat damage and pushing damage through, Breath of Fury is a must-have. And the final section of the deck is the mana base, so let's quickly go through which lands we'll be keeping, removing, and adding. First up is the dual lands, and we're going to be keeping Foreboding Ruins, Smoldering March, Tainted Peak, Temple of Malice, and Shadowblood Ridge. We're also going to be keeping the Command Tower, Path of Ancestry, and Myriad Landscape. As for basic lands, we're going to be keeping 9 mountains and 10 swamps. Lands that we're going to be getting rid of are Exotic Orchard, Temple of the False God, and Unclaimed Territory. The reason for this is they're just all way too specific and too unreliable. We're also going to be cutting Rakdos Carnarium, it's a bounce land and we can do without it. Replacing those lands, we have Barbarian Ring, Cabal Pit, High Market, Ivnir Deadlands, Ramunap Ruins, and Voldaren Estate. These all come into play untapped and have little bonus effects that we can squeeze some extra value out of. We're also going to be adding a Haunted Ridge, which comes into play tapped unless you already control 2 lands, and a Leech-Ridden Swamp, which comes into play tapped, but lets you ping everybody for 1 each turn. And with the mana base covered, that is the entire Precon upgrade for Crimson Vow's Vampiric Bloodline deck, with Strafon Morer Progenitor as the commander. Right now, as I'm recording, the cost of these upgrades is $46.56, so a few bucks shy of 50, and like I was saying at the beginning, I think there's a decent amount of room for you to remove a few cards and add some of your own picks or your favorite pet cards. For example, there's a few Blood Artist type effects, including Blood Artist itself, that don't really play a big role in the deck. There was also a bunch of low-cost vampires I mentioned that seem pretty medium in terms of spice level. I'd say there's about 2 to 6 spaces there in the 2 to 4 mana range that you could play around with. And at 36 lands, not including 2 MDFCs, that might be a little high for some people, so you can find some wiggle room there. And lastly, I wanted to give an honorable mention to a card that would be absolutely phenomenal in this deck, but I decided not to include it because the cheapest version right now is $10. And I can't realistically or honestly recommend spending $10 on a single card for a budget upgrade. It just makes no sense. And that card is Olivia Crimson Bride, a 6-mana, 3/4 flying vampire with haste, and whenever she attacks, she can return a creature card from your graveyard back to the battlefield tapped and attacking. It's a very strong card with vampire synergy, and the reanimation effect would be really awesome in this deck, but like I said, it's $10 for the regular art version and about $20 for the Fang art version, and if you want to go all out, the Dracula altar art is about $30. So yeah, technically the additions to this deck only come to about $47, so if you want to squeeze in an extra 10 in there for Olivia Crimson Bride, it's definitely a great card to add. As mentioned previously, you can find a link to the deck list in the video description down below, as well as a spreadsheet with a list of all the cards to keep, remove, and add, and the prices for all the additions. I definitely recommend checking out the link to the deck list, because if you click stats up here at the top, you can see the mana curve as well as the number of creature and non-creature spells at each mana value. And one last thing I wanted to mention is the hand simulator. I actually have a lot of fun rolling through hands and imagining how the first few turns of the game would play out, so give it a try. But that's it for my Vampiric Bloodline Precon upgrade guide. Let me know what you think of the deck list in the comments down below. What cards would you cut and what cards would you add? Leave a comment with all of that and more, make sure you subscribe, send this video to a friend, and I'll catch you next time.